I just want to know if we are in the right place.
I think we are.
Right, okay. But we're not supposed to do this. We're not supposed to be speaking, am I? Are we? How does these things work anyway?
Oh, moderate. We just need to give him minutes. Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Commonwealth Trade and Investment Summit 2021, and to this session on a sustainable future, decarboning the economy and the race for renewals. We decided to hold this Commonwealth Summit because, as you all know, the Commonwealth Business Forum, which was scheduled for Rwanda, has been postponed twice now due to COVID. But we thought this was a very important conversation to have, particularly as COVID and the effect that COVID has had on Commonwealth economies has driven renewables and the demand for clean energy to a much greater degree than we had expected. So this is an incredibly important conversation to be having now. And as we approach this year's UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow in November, there is an increasing global realization that we are running out of time and that we really do need to be living more sustainably. You may have seen last week our friend, the endurance swimmer, Lewis Pugh, and the UN Oceans Ambassador swimming across the Ilusiat Field in Greenland over 12 days to raise awareness of the climate crisis. And the crisis in the Arctic is particularly urgent. It is the fastest warming area on the planet. And with small island states being the most vulnerable to climate change and rising sea levels, and 24 of those small island states are Commonwealth countries, it is vital that businesses identify deliverable outcomes that will reduce the ongoing impact of climate change and move us quickly towards renewable energy-driven economies. We have very clear and concrete examples of the impact of climate change. Countries like Tuvalu are disappearing. Fiji is having to move communities off islands that are submerging. And we have seen periods of prolonged drought across Africa. The solutions are complex, and the push for net zero brings with it punitive taxes and more regulation that can be burdensome for businesses. Yet business is making great progress, and we need to highlight what is working and best practice. In the past decade, the cost of electricity generation from onshore wind has fallen by 40%, and renewable energy generation is still cheaper than building new stations to burn fossil fuels. The cost of solar has fallen even faster than wind. In the countdown to COP26, CWEIC is going to be showcasing some of the green innovations from our member network. For example, Royal Mail Group has committed to 100% of its fleet being powered by alternative fuel by 2050. Prudential has created a dedicated investment team called Catalyst that is ready to invest up to $5 billion for sustainable projects. In Australia, the Queensland Government has set a target to have 50% of the state's renewable energy or generation coming from renewable sources by 2030, and we'll be hearing from the Premier of Queensland a little later. Over the next hour, we're going to look at how government and business need to work together to tackle the issues of our times, and we have an excellent panel here to do that. Firstly, we are honoured to be joined by the Honourable Minister Chet Green, Minister for Immigration and Trade from Antigua and Barbuda. CWIC has been working closely with Antigua and Barbuda to develop a centre of excellence for oceanography and the blue economy, and that will play a vital role in combating climate change into the future. After that, we will hear from His Excellency Mohammed Nasheed, Speaker of the People's Majlis in the Maldives. His Excellency is a former President of the Maldives and the first democratically elected President, which has not been an easy path for him, as we know. His Excellency has played a prominent role in advocating for nations to curb greenhouse gas emissions that threaten his nation. In 2009, to make the point, President Nasheed held the first ever underwater cabinet meeting where participants were dressed in scuba gear. President Nasheed also implemented policies to turn the Maldives into the world's first carbon neutral country. One of the islands in the Maldives is the world's lowest high point at 2.4 metres. So the situation is particularly urgent for them. We have Richard Abel, Managing Director of UK Climate Investments, which sits in the Green Investment Group of Macquarie Group. Richard has also served as a senior civil servant in the UK government. UK Climate Investments works to mobilise private sector investors in some of the world's most carbon-intensive economies by leading the way and showing how it's done. And finally, we have Magdalena Cavena, Director General of the Renewable Energy Efficiency Partnership, or REAP, and CWEIC is delighted to have a formal partnership with REAP. REAP designs and implements tailor-made financing mechanisms using strategic injections of public funding to build sustainable markets and make clean energy technology accessible and affordable in low and middle income countries. I now have a couple of housekeeping points. We will start the meeting with opening remarks from Minister Green. We will then have a short video from the Premier of Queensland, the Honourable Anastasia Palaszczuk. Next, we will move to our panellists who will give 2-minute opening remarks, and then we'll move to a panel discussion and questions which will come from our audience. I'd now like to invite the Honourable Minister Chet Green, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Immigration and Trade from Antigua and Barbuda. Minister. We don't seem to have sound for you, Minister. That's better.
I'm not hearing you very clearly.
We can hear you. We can hear you now, Minister.
I assume that this is the time I make my intervention.
Yes, if you could make your opening
I will
remarks.
do so by first of all thanking the organizers of this very important summit. The timing of which could not be better as we, global community, fight our way through this very deadly pandemic. Governments the world over have been battling two significant fronts over the last 2 years, namely the economic and social impact of the global COVID-19 pandemic, and secondly, the existential threat posed by the climate crisis. For small island developing states such as mine, the negative consequences of these challenges have been amplified multiple times because of our very inherent vulnerabilities. For small states, the situation is most egregious, as we are the least contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, but the most affected by climate change. By way of amplification, collectively, the 44 countries of AOSIS emit just 1.5% of the emissions of industrialized nations. It's against this backdrop that I wish to share 3 perspectives on this topic. And they are, firstly, small states as leaders. Second, the urgent need for greater access to finance for investment in renewable energy. And in thirdly, greater support to deal with the catastrophic consequences of climate change. I will deal with the first point first, that of small states as leaders. I will start by noting that there is a need for genuine global acknowledgement of leadership that small states continue to show in advocating for accelerated decarbonization, as well as in transitioning to renewable energy. As I stated before, we know that small island states are the least contributors to greenhouse emissions, yet we have been at the forefront of adapting our energy programs to consume more renewables and less fossil fuels, and to even further reduce our tiny carbon footprints. My country, Antigua and Barbuda, for example, has committed to implementing wind and solar to propel our transition to low carbon commitment of the Paris Agreement. Our government has committed 100% renewable share in the power and transport sectors by 2030, with 90% of this energy being generated from solar and wind, and remaining 10% from green hydrogen and electric vehicles. A cursory look at what we've done so far would show that we've initiated a 10 megawatt solar photovoltaic project. We removed all the charges and duties on renewable energy technologies. We have negotiated soft loans for renewables, including high-tech wind and hybrid wind-only interactive power grids. And these investments have the added advantage of creating high-paying, high-quality jobs and other business opportunities, especially for youth. My government has established an entrepreneurial development fund, which includes as one of its targets encouraging more women to get involved in decarbonization, whether as entrepreneurs, investor partners, sole investors, technicians, or policy experts. On the point of access to finance the transition to renewable energy, it should be noted that the government of Antigua and Barbuda continues to advocate for the urgent reformulation of the global financial architecture to facilitate greater access to finance for vulnerable states, to transition into renewable energy alongside making more affordable technology for people. It is also noteworthy that in 2015, Antigua and Barbuda co-facilitated the negotiations on the finance goal of the Paris Agreement, that is Articles 2, 1, and 1C. For citizens of other developing countries, grant and concessional financing from a variety of international sources will play a crucial and critical role in assisting us with catalyzing this transition. As chair of AOSIS, one of our main objectives is to advocate for membership's development and use of sustainable and innovative financial instruments beyond the traditional grant and concessional loans. This includes debt for climate swaps and equity. Our initial programs for support of the use of clean energy, I must admit, have not always been or proven to be value for money. For example, we borrowed tens of millions to invest in clean energy, but now need to wait for cheaper prices and more efficient green technologies, including hydrogen, to become available. Our ambition therefore remains to transform Barbuda into a green island economy. On the third point of greater support for addressing financial consequences of climate change, Antigua and Barbuda has been among countries arguing for compensation to small and vulnerable states from large emitters when climate change results in natural disasters to islands. We need only consider or reflect on the impacts of hurricanes on Barbuda, on Dominica, the Bahamas, the east coast of the United States, to mention a few, over the last 10 years, to understand and get a better appreciation of the massive financial dislocations that climate change can and has unleashed. Denying countries like mine access to concessional financing, even after major storms, while continuing to use the GDP per capita exclusionary criteria, needs to be urgently addressed. Antigua and Barbuda continues its advocacy on the need to adopt and implement a vulnerability index. Chairman, colleagues, in closing, I wish to continue as we face the challenges that slow progress towards a more sustainable future. To overcome these challenges, we need more investment, more trade, more access to concessional financing and grants, more access to high quality and affordable technologies, more technical assistance, and more support from our international partners. It is our hope that COP26 will advance meaningful discussions and encourage greater yet the commitments to protecting our shared planet Earth. It pleases you, Chairman, as we continue the discourse today, reflecting and projecting, I wish to once again give the assurances and commitment on the part of the government and the people of Antigua and Barbuda to be meaningful partners as we reset the global clock, as we rebuild our national economies, as we promote inclusion in the global undertakings before us. I thank you and wish us all a successful summit. God bless.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister. That was a very enlightening speech. We appreciate your remarks. We're now going to see a short video submitted by the Premier of Queensland, Australia, the Honourable Anastasia Palaszczuk, who could not join us live due to the time difference. Thank you.
You may have heard very exciting news. The world will come to Queensland for the 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games. And by 2030, we want Queensland Renewables to provide at least 50% of our power. We see renewables and the Games as the basis of an ambitious trade agenda. The 2032 Games will be carbon neutral with greenhouse gas reductions greater than the residual emissions. And while athletes bask in our sunshine, we'll be showcasing Queensland's abundant energy in sun, wind and water. I know our climate positive Games will inspire the world and provide a rematch between our nations. Congratulations on Britain's medal tally in 2021. With natural advantages and the skills to turn ideas into action, Queensland will be a renewable superpower. We're ahead of the pack when it comes to global demand for renewable hydrogen. Led by the world's first Minister for Hydrogen, our 5-year Queensland hydrogen industry strategy is supporting this industry to develop. We've already connected investment from major energy groups, including Japan's largest domestic hydrogen supplier, the Iwatani Corporation. At its peak, their green hydrogen project alone could provide more than 5,000 jobs, $4.2 billion in hydrogen exports, and $10 billion to our economy. For our citizens and for yours, we are investing in a cleaner, greener future. In the lead up to Glasgow Climate Change Conference later this year, it's timely to reflect on our role. And I'm proud to lead a state which is rising to the challenge. We have set ourselves ambitious climate targets, starting with renewables and targeting zero net emissions by 2050. And these targets have sent a clear message to industry. Queensland is open for renewable business and investment. In the race for renewables, we are off the starting block. My government has seen 44 large-scale renewable energy projects either commenced, under construction or financially committed. Combined, these projects represent 7,000 jobs and almost $10 billion in investments in renewables in Queensland. We're also very excited about the importance of agtech in creating a greener global future. Agriculture will be part of the climate change solution, and Queensland's innovations can contribute. Our primary industries are known globally for their quality and their clean, green, reliable, secure systems. This has not been achieved by luck or by chance. We have the ideal environment for global investment opportunities. We have diverse climates and crops, excellent transport, skilled workers and a strong R&D. As the world reopens, we look forward to welcoming you back to Queensland and making the most of free trade between our nations. I invite you to reach out to Queensland's Trade and Investment Office in London, and I encourage you to take up your opportunities in Queensland as we work towards the 2032 Games and our renewable future.
Thank you, Premier. Well, of course, before the 2030 Games, we have the the Commonwealth Games next year in Birmingham in 2022, and there will be increasing pressure to make those Games as sustainable as possible, and I'm sure that you will all take part in that. I'd now like to call on His Excellency Mohammed Nasheed.
I'd like to start by thanking the Commonwealth Enterprise Forum for making this conference possible. Of course, it's through virtual means and therefore difficult, but we are still meeting. The cost of renewables is about the cost of borrowing. This is a particular issue for renewable energy, which in effect requires the purchase of the purchaser to buy 20 years worth of electricity in one day. Because almost the entire cost of renewable energy is in the equipment and installation. The cost of capital or borrowing of a renewable energy project is therefore paramount to its economic viability. Fossil fuels do not face this problem because the cost of building a generator is relatively low. And the expensive part, the fuel, is bought in small amounts over the lifespan of the project. Renewable energy in any given situation is now economically more viable, financially more feasible. The internal combustion engine and fossil fuel technology is obsolete, it's old, and it's Victorian. We need to change. And when we think of that change, there are many issues that we come across. Firstly, the capital cost being very high. And also in most climate vulnerable countries, political instability, high debt levels, and destabilizing effects of climate change have left them with high borrowing costs, estimates over 10 to 20% on commercial loans. This actually creates an energy paradox. Even though renewable energy produces a unit of electricity far cheaper than fossil fuel, they do not have access to the cheap capital required to install renewable energy at scale. What is more, many vulnerable countries are in debt distress. And this debt distress has made worse by climate change. Some 10% to 20% of national budgets often go to serving the debt, and another 20 to 30% to climate adaptation projects. We just can't do that. We cannot spend on renewable energy, adaptation, and then continue to serve our debts. Many of the infrastructure projects that the loans were taken for now require climate proofing because the climate has got worse quicker than anybody predicted, even a decade ago. The recent IPCC statement makes clear that the climate emergency is already upon us. This was not the case when our countries took the loan. We simply cannot pay back the loans which were predicted on a stable climate continuing. Working with other climate vulnerable forum leaders, we are proposing climate debt swaps for our nations to enable us to protect infrastructure, adapt to climate change, and to decarbonize our economies. Now, even when you have the money, after having perhaps gone through all these hurdles, there are a number of difficulties that we face. As we do not have the regulatory frameworks, the legislations. Many climate vulnerable countries and small islands face this difficulty. They do not have, let's say, the feed-in tariff systems, the power purchasing agreements, and therefore we need legislative reform. Secondly, the existing and usually the state-owned enterprise that owns power production and distribution already have existing investments and commitments that they find difficult to disengage from. In my experience, much of the commitments are from the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and China. Recently, the Asian Development Bank was vehemently trying to see if the Maldives would take on a gas project. Secondly, the existing fossil fuel generating state-owned companies have suppliers for consumables. They feel that if we switch, they're going to lose the contracts, which we must consider. Then there is a bigger problem. The existing state-owned enterprises, the governing structures of these enterprises feel that they are going to lose power, jobs, and influence if we switch to renewables. So I think two things I'm trying to mention here. One, that it's difficult to get the money because it's extremely expensive. Capital cost is high, and borrowing is difficult. Secondly, even when we get the money, we have transition problems. And that is the legislative issues that I mentioned, the power and influence loss I mentioned, the governance issues that I mentioned, and the supply line, the issues that I mentioned. So I think here the Commonwealth has a very big opportunity to play a role in a transition plan for renewables. How you transit from the fossil fuel to the renewables and try to work with national governments in doing so. The Minister of Foreign Affairs from Antigua, thank you so much. Yes, you are now the chair of the small islands, and as we go to the COP, we have these issues. I am sure that you would be definitely working hard so that we may be able to overcome these issues. And the good minister from Australia, I hope you would come with high ambitions, NDCs under the Paris Agreement. We've not seen them yet, but hopefully as we get to the COP, Australia will have a very high ambition and the nationally determined contributions would be better. We are in an emergency. We cannot drag this anymore. Climate change is real, it is happening, and it is happening now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. We'll now ask Richard Abel from UK Climate Investments to speak on investment and financing side.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this excellent event today. Perhaps I might pick up on the previous speaker's sense of urgency about investing and making the climate transition, which is well understood and I think is shared in the investment and financial community, where there is an increasing level of response to global signals, as well as signals from consumers and corporate customers to play as big a part as possible with the pension and other institutional capital to support that energy transition. I also accept that the context in which it takes place is often challenging. There is sort of legacy systems. There is issues of potentially fiscal capacity, the need for guarantees where national power off-takers or other funders of infrastructure are somewhat constrained in terms of what new activity they can take on. So, look, as an investor, we are very mindful of that broader political and global context, and are very much equally looking to play our part as part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero in the global financial community, and thinking through what sort of partnerships can work between the investment community, where there is this capital that needs to earn an appropriate risk-adjusted return on the part of the ultimate owners of that capital, but who also wants to support and see this transition happen, to be part of doing environmental good globally. And that clearly involves the MDBs, involves governments around the world in thinking through that broader context. Where we have been involved and have seen sort of positive signs is, as already mentioned by my esteemed colleagues earlier, the rapid decrease in the price of solar equipment, which has outpaced pretty much all predictions over the last decade. It's now 90% of the cost that it was in the manufacturing cycle, supported by the original investment programs and contracts for difference and other similar schemes, is bearing fruit now. That's not to diminish what I said, what I acknowledged earlier around some of the challenges around transition, but that's a much better place to be than the equipment, still being too expensive at a kind of nominal level for many countries to be able to consider it. So that's one sort of optimistic or more optimistic aspect, and the second one maybe which I would pick up is, there is increasing understanding about what is needed in terms of sort of governance, procurement, and to try and get the sort of repeat processes for procuring renewable energy and other infrastructure investments in jurisdictions around the world. Macquarie has played a part in the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative, which we recently did a report on some of those considerations that apply to try and lower the cost of capital, to try and attract more of this institutional capital into the energy transition in these sectors. So I think understanding is increasing. There's a lot of way to go. There's a lot of capital interested in the space, and working in partnership with colleagues and providers of national capital, multilateral banks, as well as governments and national authorities, we would very much want to play our part in UK climate investments and Macquarie more broadly, and the wider financial community in making a success of this for all countries and states around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And finally, we will ask Magdalena Koneva, Director General of REAP, to say some words about financial instruments.
Thank you, Sam, and thanks for inviting me. I would like to really echo what the previous speakers said, and also probably start by saying, yes, it is true that we have a climate emergency, but I think we also need to recognize our generation is probably the last one that can do something about this. It's a huge responsibility. REAP has been in existence for 20 years as a multilateral, multi-stakeholder partnership. Nowadays, I think it is without saying that all parts of society have a role to play in the clean energy transition. But already 20 years ago, it was recognized that climate change requires solutions which go beyond state-to-state cooperation and require the involvement of private sector. And here is, first of all, I really sympathize with the small island states and the challenges that they face. We've seen, as REAP, we've seen similar challenges working across least developed countries. The bottom line is emerging markets already provide half of the new generation in clean energy. However, this growth is not equally distributed. And what we've seen is that least developed countries, low and lower middle income countries, small island states have much less private capital attracted in clean energy than the rest of the countries. So the growth is uneven, that's number one. Secondly, when we talk about the Paris objective and the clean energy transition, and coming on behalf of REAP as a renewable energy efficiency partnership, I also want to state very clearly we need more implementation tools. As the climate transition should not be at the expense of food security, should not be at the expense of sustainable development, should not be at the expense of the gains in poverty reduction. And with the race to zero targets coming from governments and companies, and the changes in the global supply chain, we see threats, specifically given the increasing adaptation needs of countries at the forefront of climate change. It was mentioned that the small island states, they need to spend more of their GDP to counter the negative effects of climate change. We've seen that, for instance, once again, just to mention one example from Africa, current adaptation needs are estimated to be 7 to 15 billion annually, and they are projected to increase to 35 billion and even 50 billion by 2050, depending on how well we do with the climate objectives. At the same time, same as small island states, these countries have contributed less than 3 to 4% of the global emissions. Africa represents currently 70% of the global population, but if we look at the numbers in clean energy investment between 2019 and 2020, it represents less than 1% of investment in clean energy. At the same time, the continent is expected to add 1 billion of population by 2050. In other words, the future of energy demand is coming from these countries which are currently they have their own very ambitious national development objectives. It is upon the global climate architecture to be able to support the sustainable objectives so that the future of energy demand is clean. And from practical experiences, what we've seen is REAP is not just, this is not just about mobilizing more resources, whether it's grants or concession or climate resources. This is also about having the tools to utilize the resources. We have come across a number of dedicated green concessional lines that are available but not used in the countries in which we operate due to a variety of factors. But I think we need to recognize capacity constraints are a significant part. There is significant opportunity to reorient the local financial ecosystem to be a green financial ecosystem and support the role of national development banks really to play a role that can reorient financing flows towards across green sectors. But for this to happen, a lot of support is required on greening and creating the pipelines that are required for investors to invest. Just final note, we've seen from our experience, and I agree here with Richard, there is a lot of interest to invest in clean energy and energy transition in emerging markets. However, there is significant disconnect with the availability of pipeline. We often receive requests to help global funds to basically reach a pipeline in these countries. And the disconnect is, I like saying, it's not about the supply of capital and instruments. Capital and instruments are there. The issue is on the availability of quality pipeline of projects that investors consider investor ready. And I believe it was the previous speaker who also mentioned the small size barrier. That is not to be underestimated, because the like investors that Richard is representing probably won't be interested in a small size project. They're looking for aggregation, for innovative financial instruments to create the size that is the size in which institutional investors would invest with the right risk. So that is where we require more innovation, and I do agree we require to rethink the global climate architecture and create these channels to have country-driven solutions at the same time as mobilizing more resources and crowding in more capital. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. So the picture we have painted here from our panelists is not particularly optimistic, and it's particularly urgent and critical for small island states, as we've heard. I think we've got a disconnect in the financing mechanisms that are available and the projects that are ready to be financed. I want to just look to best practice. I want to look at countries that are achieving some success in this area. And if we look at a country like Kenya, they've achieved about 90% of their energy sources now coming from renewable energy, which is really quite outstanding. And they are the largest geothermal energy producer in Africa. But governments really do need to develop cohesive policies to enable that investment to come into the country, and I think Kenya's done that quite successfully. I just asked Richard, how can governments, what do they need to do? How can they create legislative frameworks that are more able to attract inward investment and to attract capital that is priced reasonably in order to fast track renewables?
So I think the features that we would observe in Africa, for example, the South African Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Programme, REAP, it's, there's predictable, repeatable process, and where that pipeline, as Magdalena was pointing out earlier, is the developers and financiers and the professional support that is associated with those processes of investment can see that sort of forward look, and it's an understood and repeatable programme. That works well. It tends to, attract a lot of interest, and that consequently makes it pretty competitive. So it's generally a good outcome for the taxpayer or consumer, as well as a decent one for the developer and investor. I think India has got it's now got the world's largest reverse auction solar energy program. Again, that sort of principle where people can see a pipeline coming and a sort of opportunities for repeat investment, I think are sort of key features, and sort of standardization, through the process. Obviously, some processes will be big, some will be smaller, but that sort of standardization, identifiable pipeline, and sort of regular repeat process, well governed, well managed, are some of the critical aspects of success. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And I think this is where the Commonwealth can perhaps play a convening role in bringing countries together to talk about the frameworks that governments need to establish in order to make this happen. Because I think there's a lack of knowledge, lack of confidence, a lack of ability to access the right financial instruments. And it seems to me that we need to create a platform that brings all of those elements together to learn where we have achieved success, and to enable those who are struggling, those countries and jurisdictions who are struggling, to come in and learn from others. And particularly also knowledge about how to expand projects and bring them to a much larger scale, because I think His Excellency touched on that. Thank you. I'd like to just move a little bit to oceans, because I think for Antigua and Barbuda and the Maldives, obviously, oceans play a critical role in maintaining our climate, and they absorb about 30% of excess carbon dioxide emissions and 90% of the heat from global warming. But what more do we need to do to protect our oceans? And I think we have in recent months really focused on the need to protect oceans, but what realistically do we need to do? I think I'll ask His Excellency Nasheed to take that question first.
To reduce carbon emission so that the world temperature does not rise above 1.5 degrees when counting from the Industrial Revolution. carbon content in the atmosphere must remain at 350 parts per million. When the planet heats up, the ocean heats much faster, and then that creates a very rapid loss of our ocean biodiversity. The coral reef starts bleaching, and they die. When the coral reefs die, the waves become stronger, and our shorelines are under much more stress. There is coastal erosion, and therefore we keep on losing land. Also, when coral reefs die, we lose the bait fish. And when we do not have the bait fish, we also lose our tuna industry. And so therefore, again, we lose our livelihood. Another huge impact on the ocean is on fishing methods. We have these huge trawlers impersonating factory ships that sweeps the ocean from the bottom up with every little life caught in their nets. We can't have that practice going on. The people in the Maldives, for instance, fish one by one. We hook the thing and then we catch it. In fact, while doing that, our fishing effort is probably as good as any trawler, big, huge, purse-seining vessel. Now, we are very often said that we are small island states, but actually we are big ocean states. The Maldives is 1,000 kilometers from north to south, and another 600 kilometers from east to west. You cannot cross the navigable parts of the Indian Ocean without going through the Maldives. So stop purse-seining, bring in some form of regulation on fishing practice. The Indian Ocean Tuna Conference is the fora for that, and Britain now, because of Diogo Garcia, is a member of the Indian Ocean Tuna Conference. We hope that we will be able to bring some amount of restraint on fishing methods. So bring changes to fishing methods. Of course, the thing is to decarbonize and stop emission. And that's kind of far more the most important thing. Two things: change technology and methods and decarbonize. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I'll just ask Minister Chet Green to comment on that. What more can we be doing to protect our oceans? You in Antigua and Barbuda have a particularly large ocean jurisdiction, and I know that you have a lot of opportunity to protect that area.
Well, the issue of protecting our oceans is such a wide area, and the techniques and challenges are equally real. We have opted to go in the direction of crafting a blue economy strategy and program. We're twinning with the University of West Indies, which is now domiciled in Antigua, this Fort Lauderdale campus. And so we're given scientific attention to the issue of ocean protection and the whole question of the blue economy. The points made by my colleague in terms of overfishing and managing the fish stocks is also another very important area of management of our marine resources. The whole question of pollution and plastics. We'd have passed legislation in Antigua Barbuda to protect the whole question of controlling the use of plastics, single-use plastics. And so it's a continued and continuous effort to protect our oceans, to protect our marine resources. As I said, it's now been twinned between the traditional, typical, everyday protection methods with an addition of science and academia, so that it is now a major platform in the context of not only management of local ocean spaces, but a global compact of the whole marine sector. So again, we do what we can, and we promote those things which we see to be in the interest of not only Antigua Barbuda, but the citizens, the wider global community, but we're also open to those techniques and interventions made by other countries. And so I really welcome the comments made by my colleague. as he outlined the methods of engagement on his end.
Thank you, Minister. I think one of the things we've seen a result of the focus on the environment and the race for renewables is a more punitive taxation regime in many countries, particularly developed countries. I'd just like to ask Magdalena whether environmental taxes may run the risk of sending companies to less onerous jurisdictions where we could encounter the same problems. If you could just comment on that.
Well, this is certainly a risk, and we've seen this risk within the financial flows. Africa is losing more finance in illicit flows than receiving from ODA grants, and that have been established there a number of reports. So it's certainly a risk. On the other hand, I do think that environmental tax could be very useful machinery to promote the kind of behavior that we want to see. But they need to be developed with the checks and balances, and it can't be done in isolation. I have high expectation actually that the upcoming discussions around the COP will be the platform that will move us forward on some of these global arrangements, global agreements. I believe His Excellency was talking about more ambition. That's the platform where hopefully we'll see a moment of more ambition.
Well, thank you, Magdalena. That brings us to a close for our session. I think this has thrown up some really interesting points that we need to develop, and I think the Commonwealth, as I said, is a very good platform to enable us to convene and to take some of these initiatives forward. The idea of a vulnerability index for small island states, I think, is a very good one. Looking again probably in more detail about access to finance and reducing the cost of financing environmental initiatives at scale, particularly for those countries which, as Nasheed said, are really crippled by debt following the pandemic and the effects of climate change and cyclones, and the impact that has increased exponentially. So these are very serious issues. They need detailed answers and they need examining. And I think that's something that CWIC would be very pleased to take forward. We are already working with all of you, but I think there's a lot more we can be doing to provide solutions and to come up with workshops that potentially as well look at legislative frameworks and policies going forward. So thank you very much for your participation today. I'd just like to, in closing, invite delegates to rejoin our Commonwealth Trade and Investment Summit tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. We have a session on financial services, fintech to consumer finance. Lord Marland will be chairing that with Senator Ian Gorst from Jersey. We have the Chief Executive Officer from the Universal Merchant Bank, Wilf Blackburn from Prudential, and Michael Kent from Asimo will be talking about fintech and consumer finance. Thank you very much for your time, and we now are going to be at 3:30 holding the Global Advisory Council meeting for CWIC members only, but we look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.